This is where the video series gets fun, and by fun, I mean socially conservative. Social conservatism is designed to cope with the tragic flaws of human nature, and that opens up a lot of rich and fascinating social science. So we're going to do an economic analysis and put social conservatism on economic principles in the exact same way that we put the defense of monopoly and oligopoly markets on economic principles. One of the most famous theorems in economics is the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. It's basically a mathematical proof that free markets will reach the most efficient outcome possible, provided that some assumptions are met. There are a whole bunch of assumptions that go into this theory, so I'll only list 3 of them. They are 1. Perfect competition, 2. People are rational, and 3. People's choices will not hurt others, even indirectly. This theorem has been the center of a lot of economic debate, so here's a quick history on that before we move on to the main content. It was initially championed by economic conservatives who held it up as a proof of the efficiency of free markets. But it didn't take long for liberal economists to get the upper hand on it. They pointed out that these assumptions are almost never true in the real world, so the first fundamental theorem is really a proof that markets almost always fail and therefore need heavy government intervention. Conservatives have had 2 main responses that have allowed the pendulum to swing back into their court. The first is what we've already seen in the previous videos on creative destruction and monopoly. A world of perfect competition may be efficient and it may prevent firms from exploiting consumers, but it's also a stagnant world where technology never improves and people's lives are never any better. A world of imperfect competition is one where firms can innovate and create new products and learn how to make old products for a lot less money and therefore benefit consumers. The second response was to apply an economic analysis to the incentives of government. This is a branch of economics called public choice theory, and I'll have a whole video on that later in the series. For now, all you need to know is that it should not come as a tremendous shock to find out that analyzing government showed that it's not very efficient. So it's not enough for the left to point out that markets depart from theoretical perfection. They have to also show that government, for all its warts and flaws, can do a better job. And that's not generally true. What's important about the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics from a socially conservative perspective is that it shows us where social norms are required. A social norm is basically an unwritten rule about how people are supposed to behave. Not being racist is a great example of a social norm. There's no law written down that says you can't be racist, but we have a strong social norm against racism. Some social norms are relatively minor, like not cutting in line or not checking your phone at a movie theater. This video is about the second assumption that we were looking at for the first fundamental theorem, the assumption that people are rational. Now, it should be obvious that people are not always rational, and so therefore markets may be inefficient. And the main way that happens is that people make choices that are not good for them. And to look at that, we're going to turn to one of the most famous social science experiments called the Marshmallow Test. The test was created by the social scientist Walter Mischel, and it was designed to test the ability of children to defer gratification. The children in this study were about 5 years old. The researcher would lead the children into a sparsely furnished room and sit them at a table with a marshmallow on a plate. And he would make this deal with the child. You can eat this marshmallow, but if you haven't eaten it when I come back in a bit, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. So you can see that children who had good impulse control and who could control their own behavior were able to wait the 15 minutes and get the reward of having an extra marshmallow. And the children who had poor impulse control just ate the marshmallow right away. Then Walter Mischel waited for the children to grow up, and what he found was astonishing. The children who had waited for the second marshmallow scored an average of 210 points higher on the SAT than those who couldn't. The 2 marshmallow children also got along better with their peers and were generally more successful as young adults than the 1 marshmallow children. The 1 marshmallow children tended to be stressed out, disorganized, and generally less successful. And real-world results seem to confirm this as well. William Galston is a Democrat who worked as an advisor to Bill Clinton when Clinton was president, and he found 3 rules that people need to do to avoid being poor. Those rules were 1, graduate from high school, 2, wait until age 20 to marry, and 3, wait until marriage to have children. If you do those 3 things, your odds of being poor are only 8%. but if you don't do them, your odds of being poor are 79%. What's striking about these 3 rules is that they're all basically the Marshmallow Test with higher stakes. Graduate from high school, wait until age 20 to marry, wait until marriage to have children. That's something that everybody should be able to achieve, even if they're not blessed with a high degree of natural patience or a high degree of intelligence. I don't think our liberal push to send everybody to college is realistic for most people, but graduating from high school should be realistic for most people. At this point, liberal listeners are probably thinking, aha, another conservative blaming the poor for their poverty. But I'm not blaming the poor, I'm actually blaming the left. Each of William Galston's 3 rules should be a social norm, but unfortunately they are not. Or at least, they aren't anymore. There's an old joke that goes like this: if scientists were to discover that the world were to be destroyed tomorrow, the headline in the New York Times would say, "World ends tomorrow, women, minorities hardest hit." But in the case of the sexual revolution, the old joke is 100% true. The sexual revolution happened, and women and minorities were the hardest hit. The left has created an entirely new class of poverty that did not exist previously in Western history, namely poverty from single motherhood. And this absolutely hit minorities the hardest. The tragic irony of it is that the civil rights movement had largely finished its major work just as the sexual revolution was beginning. And because of this timing, black people had never had a chance to develop those bourgeois middle-class norms. How do you develop the norms built around having a successful life when society won't actually let you have a successful life? It was only after the end of the civil rights movement that black people finally had a chance to get ahead and develop a culture that would allow them to get ahead, and that's when the sexual revolution hit. So black people were looking forwards to moving into mainstream middle-class American life, and then they got hit by a Mack truck called the sexual revolution. The book The First Measured Century gives us hard numbers on this change. As the title of the book suggests, the goal was to measure how the 20th century changed life from the beginning to the end. And they looked at all sorts of changes, including changes to marriage and family. And here's what they found. In 1917, the earliest year they could get data, only 12% of black children were born to single mothers. But today that number is 70%, according to the Centers for Disease Control. Teenage pregnancy has declined, and that's a good thing, but unfortunately single motherhood has increased. I think large numbers of young people in America don't even realize that there was a time when most black children grew up with married parents in neighborhoods where it was safe to walk the streets at night without fear of getting shot. And nowadays, only the older members of the black community can remember those times, and it won't be long before they're gone, and the entire black community in America will be a community of people who have largely grown up without their fathers. Maybe I'm being a little too hyperbolic, but I think that's an act of cultural genocide. And if conservatives had done anything that traumatic to the black family, you can be sure that liberals would be using that term. And if you really want a visual proof for how much the sexual revolution has changed society, you can go onto YouTube and do a search for Harlem in the 1930s. And there's digitally restored video of black community in Harlem going about their lives in the 1930s. And keep in mind, this is still a time of legalized segregation. Even in New York City, there was still legalized segregation then. And yet you see people who are well-dressed, living lives of purpose and dignity. But if you do a YouTube search for Harlem in the 1980s, then you find a very, very different outlook. It looks like the place had been the victim of a bombing attack. Now, I'm not saying that the sexual revolution is worse than Jim Crow, but it does place it in the appropriate ballpark. The sexual revolution did not just harm the black community. We've also created a brand new category of poverty among whites with single motherhood in the white community, and the same with Hispanics. The only group that really hasn't seen a significant rise in out-of-wedlock childbirths is the Asian community. Now, whenever I bring up the sexual revolution and all the poverty that it caused, particularly to minorities, the left usually distance themselves from it. So here's a 270-year intellectual history of the left arguing for the sexual revolution. As always, anything involving the left begins with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau himself was actually a defender of marriage and traditional gender roles, but his overall philosophy was one that saw civilization, civilization's institutions, and the social norms of civilization as being a corrupting force that took mankind away from their natural state of innocence and into this world of strife and conflict. So in Rousseau, we begin to see the attack on social norms from the left, and we see the battle line set up between conservatives who defend social norms and liberals who criticize social norms. The next major intellectual is Mary Wollstonecraft, who is considered to be the first feminist. She was an English woman who moved to France during the French Revolution. She wanted to be a part of that movement and the energy and the excitement that it brought. And her most famous book is her 1792 book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in it, she argued for women to receive educations so that they could be more independent, and she argued against marriage because marriage made women dependent. She then goes on to criticize marriage as a form of legal prostitution that women enter into for the economic benefits and not out of love and affection and companionship. Mary's life is fascinating, and it's also a parable on the perils of feminism. If you step back and think about conservatism versus leftism, conservatism is about accepting the limits of human nature and trying to find a way to have a flourishing life within that. And leftism is about trying to overcome human nature and then creating a flourishing life. But as the economist Thomas Sowell points out, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. So you can ignore reality and jump off a cliff, but you can't ignore the consequences of doing that. And tragically, that's what Mary Wollstonecraft's life was like. She moved to Paris during the height of the French Revolution, and there she met a man named Gilbert Imlay. They fell in love and had a daughter together, and they were both believers in this new leftist movement that rejected the old rules, and they both rejected marriage. So they did not get married despite their daughter. And of course, if you're a conservative, you know exactly why Gilbert Imlay decided to reject the rules of marriage. So at one point during the revolution, Mary went on this diplomatic tour of Scandinavia, and when she got back, she found that Gilbert had left her and had a child with another woman. So she tried to commit suicide twice, once by taking laudanum, a painkiller, and once by jumping off a bridge into the River Thames, and fortunately she was saved. Then she met another man named William Godwin, who was also a radical, but this time they did get married. But tragically, she died from complications shortly after childbirth. Luckily, her legacy did live on through her daughter, who is also a famous author, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So I think Mary Wollstonecraft is a really remarkable woman, and her life has become sort of this tragic story. She thought that she could escape all these limitations placed upon her as a woman, only to discover that these limitations existed for her protection, and that marriage was not a shackle placed upon women, it was really a shackle placed upon men, so that men could not do what her first partner did. However, feminists have not learned the lesson of Mary's life, and to this day they continue to argue that marriage is a form of controlling women. It's a patriarchal institution designed to control women. Now, the French Revolution was such a disaster with the Reign of Terror that leftism kind of went dormant for quite a long time, and it didn't rise again until Karl Marx in the 1800s. And with Marx, you see the next attack on marriage. This actually happens in two different ways. One way is that Marx, and particularly Engels, and then later Marxists, saw marriage as a classist institution that allowed inequalities in wealth to be perpetuated through generations. So you make money, you marry, you pass your money down to your kids, they marry, pass their money down to the kids, so the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. The second attack on marriage is much deeper. Marx felt that capitalism created a false consciousness and false needs among people, and that when we lived in this socialist utopia, people's true needs would emerge. So this is very similar to Rousseau in a lot of ways, where Rousseau felt that civilization was a corrupting force, and we were all chasing these sort of false desires because of our status anxieties. But in a more primitive society, or if we could return to a more primitive society through social engineering, then these social anxieties and status anxieties would disappear and authentic needs would replace them. And so Marxists had this same criticism of marriage. In the communist utopia, people would, sort of like Mary Wollstonecraft, be free to spend time with each other out of love and affection, but they wouldn't use an institution designed to limit their freedom and attach themselves. The next major figure after Marx is the psychologist Sigmund Freud, and he did not criticize marriage, but he had very ambivalent feelings about marriage. Basically, his view is that sexual repression is the price that we pay for civilization. Repressing our sexuality is necessary to channel our energies into being productive citizens and into the arts and into other creative and productive endeavors. However, this also has a very powerful trade-off, which is that sexual repression is the source of neuroses and anxieties and other psychological problems. The next major figure after Sigmund Freud is another psychologist named Wilhelm Reich. And unlike Freud, he did not have ambivalent feelings about marriage. He thought it was unambiguously bad, any form of sexual repression. And he actually wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution, where he argued that sexual repression was not just harmful psychologically, but it was the root impulse behind all authoritarian movements. So if we created a world where we ended marriage and could just have free love, then we could also end all oppression and live in a society of equality and freedom. Wilhelm Reich's ideas were very influential to Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. And you may have heard those terms because the Frankfurt School is what gave the world critical theory, which in turn gave the world critical race theory, which is one of the main ideas behind all the wokeness that we've been going on. So if your leftist friends ever want a definition of woke, that's really the definition. Herbert Marcuse was the most important member of the Frankfurt School, and he built on Wilhelm Reich's ideas, although in a somewhat more nuanced manner. And you see this in his book, Eros and Civilization. He argues that the wrong kind of sexual liberation can actually be another form of authoritarian control. And he used the Nazis as an example. The Nazis had famously kind of winked at good Aryan boys and Hitler Youth members who had promiscuous sex with good Aryan girls, because this would result in higher birth rates and more good Aryan children being born. So sexual liberation can act as a way of letting off steam, letting off these anxieties, but in a very controlled and regimented way that the state approves of. And he actually had some insights that would sound fairly conservative. Like, he was a big critic of the Marquise de Sade, who wrote the novels, the really violent, sexually violent novels that gave rise to the concept of sadism. And he argues that the Enlightenment did not free people from their old repressive notions of sexuality. Instead, it created new oppressive structures, and so the sexual violence of de Sade became this new form of oppression. So the Enlightenment got rid of one form of sexual oppression through marriage and replaced it with another form of social control and sexual control. Then the next major figure is Alfred Kinsey, who did a lot of research on sexuality in the 1940s. Now, the quality of his research is a subject of debate, and I'm not qualified to weigh in on it, but even with the most charitable interpretation, he was working with what they call convenience samples. That means people willing to participate in a study. He wasn't working with random samples. So in the 1940s, the only people willing to participate in a study that asked detailed questions about their sexual lives were probably people with unusual sexual desires. And his study showed that. It showed that sort of aberrant or abnormal sexual desires were far more common than people thought. And this was taken to be an argument against sexual repression, that our repression was all a big hypocrisy, but should probably just be understood as a fact that his convenience samples were not representative. I would say that this kind of methodology would never fly today, but the research on transgenderism is filled with convenience samples, so we really haven't progressed in the last 80 years. And in the modern times since the sexual revolution, and with all the problems that it's created, virtually every leftist magazine is filled with articles on at least a 10-to-1 ratio defending the sexual revolution. And if I do have any reasonably sophisticated liberal listeners, then they're probably bristling with hundreds of them. And I'll try and address the major objections over the course of this video series. I'll only address one right now. So as I've said, the battle lines between the left and the right are over whether or not social norms are necessary or unnecessary. And the Marshmallow Test seems to suggest that social norms are important. So not surprisingly, the left has attacked it. And the main way they've attacked it is with an alternate explanation, which could be thought of as a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Basically, they believe conservatives got the arrow of causation backwards. Poverty creates insecurity about the future. For example, a poor person might want to get his car fixed so that he can get a better job that he can't reach by bus, but he can't save the money because he's got to put food on his table. So what you get is a poverty trap. Poverty creates uncertainty and short-term needs, which in turn change the incentives to become a one marshmallow person, which in turn leads to more poverty, and so the cycle continues. Tyler Watts and his colleagues revisited the Marshmallow Test, and their initial results were quite similar to Miskel's, but after using a technique called multiple regression analysis to control for family background, early cognitive ability, home environment, then about 2/3 of the results disappeared. So the leftist theory that poor willpower was a downstream consequence of poverty seemed to be vindicated. However, Tyler Watts' research shows us a lesson that we're actually going to have a whole video on later on, which is about some of the bad methodology that scientists use and which has led to the replication crisis in the social sciences. Multiple regression analysis is a robust statistical technique, but it can be abused, and when it's abused, it can make real relationships disappear. As a general rule, you don't need to be suspicious when scientists control for the usual suspects, like age, sex, and education. But when you see unusual items on the list of control, then you should start to be concerned and treat the study as though it's got a red flag. And that's exactly what's going on with Tyler Watts' study. They controlled for family background, early cognitive ability, and the home environment. So they seem to be trying to make real relationships disappear. All three of those controls raise a red flag to me, but early cognitive ability is the worst. Basically what they're saying is if you control for skills that make you successful in life, then one marshmallow children are not any less successful than two marshmallow children. And my suspicion about the red flags in this research have been confirmed. Now, it's important to recognize that no one sets out to use weird controls when they do a multiple regression analysis. That's only what you do when you run the study and don't get the results you like. And more importantly, you don't even know what weird controls you need to use to get the results you wanted to get until after you've got the data and you can start trying them out. So one of the best defenses against this kind of shady scientific practice is to pre-register a study. That means that scientists publish the methods they will use before actually gathering data, and that methodology includes what kind of controls they'll use when they do a multiple regression analysis. In the paper Same Data Set, Different Conclusions, Laura Michelson and Yuko Manakata use the exact same data set that was used in the Tyler Watts study, but they come to the exact opposite conclusion. Their more rigorous analysis supported Miskel's original finding. The two marshmallow children did better in school, had better social skills, and had fewer problem behaviors. And as an added wrinkle to the story, Tyler Watts and colleagues did a longer-term follow-up, but this time they pre-registered their follow-up and got essentially the same results. What they leave out is that they pre-registered the exact same methodology that they used the first time when they didn't pre-register their study. So the same sort of after-the-fact fiddling with the data that worked the first time also worked the second time. And this goes to show that the left is still fighting Jean-Jacques Rousseau's battles against social norms, and they're still causing all sorts of problems and poverty because of it. And so here's my invitation to people on the left. If you don't care about this big ideological battle, but you do believe the government can help people who are poor, well, I agree with you there. I also believe the government can help people who are poor. But the government cannot solve the problem of poverty. It can only alleviate existing poverty. I think a compassionate society needs to do both things. It needs to have government programs that help people who are poor, and it needs to have healthy social norms that prevent people from becoming poor in the first place. And so my invitation is to keep your politics, except to join social conservatives when it comes to the defense of marriage and monogamy. But at this point in the video, I feel like I've been leading you on false pretenses. I said that this was a deep dive into social science, and we'll get into the social science of social norms, and yet all I did was mention one study and then give a whole lot of history about it. And this video is already pretty long, and I haven't even started to talk about the social science, so I'm going to have to wrap this one up and put that all in the next video. So let's wrap this up by talking about the conservative vision of freedom. And to start, let's think about the very nature of freedom. So freedom is making your own choices out of your own free will. If something external to you forces you to make a choice you didn't want to make, then that's a restriction on your freedom. And that's the main reason why the left has historically been opposed to social norms. They see them as a restriction on human freedom. But it gets complicated. Take the Marshmallow Test. If you make a choice that's good in the short run but hurts you in the long run, then what it really does is it restricts your freedom. A 2-marshmallow child can choose to eat no marshmallows, 1 marshmallow, or 2 marshmallows, but a 1-marshmallow child can only choose between 0 marshmallows and 1 marshmallow. Or let's think about Galston's 3 rules to avoid being poor. Graduate from high school, wait until age 20 to marry, and wait until marriage to have children. So on one hand, those are a restriction on your freedom, but if they result in you having a more successful life, making more money, better able to maintain relationships, then your freedom is actually increased. If your goal was always to have a lifelong loving relationship with a partner that you cared deeply about, then your freedom is increased if you follow those rules rather than if you break them. And in fact, that's exactly what the social science says. One of the most heartbreaking and ironically socially conservative books ever written is Promises I Can Keep by Catherine Eden and Mary Kafalis. And they do ethnographic studies on the lives of women of various different races who are single mothers. And they all deeply wanted a long-term loving commitment with a man. They all deeply valued marriage, but they were trapped in a culture where there were no good men to marry and where they lacked the life skills to make long-term committed relationships work. It's a very sad and heartbreaking look at what the lack of healthy social norms can do to a subculture. And so conservatives also have a concept of the general will. In fact, every serious political philosophy needs to have a concept of the general will. The video Populist Conservatism number 3 on free markets was about the invisible hand. And that means that the pursuit of self-interest by individuals leads to the greater good. And I said that it happens so often that it's almost enough to make you think that it's a universal principle. Unfortunately, it is not. And really, from here on out, the entire rest of this video series is about cases where the invisible hand does not work, and thus social norms have to fill in the gap. So political philosophies basically fall into 2 categories. The first is libertarianism, which holds that the invisible hand is a universal principle. The second is every other political philosophy, which holds that the invisible hand does break down sometimes, and thus you need some concept of the general will. And that can be through social norms, or that can be upheld by laws, but you need some sort of a mechanism. So here are the main ways that conservatism differs from leftism and how it regards the general will. First, don't let any of the rhetoric of leftist intellectuals fool you. Every single intellectual in this leftist tradition that I've cited, going back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, upholds Rousseau's vision of redefining freedom as submission to the general will, and that those who refuse to submit should be forced to be free. So there's an inherent authoritarianism built right into leftism. By contrast, conservatism is based on the philosophy of John Locke and individual rights, where everyone has a right to life, liberty, and property, or pursuit of happiness if you prefer the way Jefferson stated it. And those are 2 very different concepts, because as Jefferson himself put so elegantly in the Declaration of Independence, your right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness comes directly from God, and the purpose of governments is to respect and defend these rights. So on the conservative vision, governments exist to defend your rights. On the leftist vision, governments decide what is in your interest and then force you to do that. And if you're curious about these concepts and want to learn more about them, that was the main theme of Populist Conservatism number 1 on the American and French Revolutions. And that takes us to the second major difference, which is that leftism is based on the idea that regular people suffer from a false consciousness and false needs. So this again started with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where modern life had corrupted us from our state of natural innocence. In our state of natural innocence, all our needs were spontaneous, genuine, and authentic needs, but in modern life, our needs are shaped by status anxiety and the competition for social status. So it's up to the government to force us to be free by living for what he deems to be our genuine needs. And that's an idea that every leftist intellectual has run with since Rousseau. You see it in Marx with the idea of a false consciousness and false needs created by capitalism. And you see an even more wide-ranging version of this critique from Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, who gave the world critical theory and critical race theory. The next difference is that conservatives are not utopians. They don't think they're going to create the perfect world. They just want to make something a little bit better than what we've got now. By contrast, leftists, starting from Rousseau, running through the communists and to the critical theory and Frankfurt School, have been utopians. They want to radically reorganize society to make the world a better place. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin put it best: if you want to make an omelet, you've got to break a few eggs. And by break a few eggs, he meant send 20 million people to die in the gulag. And finally, conservatism is a defense of social norms that emerge spontaneously and organically from the bottom up. They were not imposed on a top-down basis by fiat. And that means that people at the grassroots have to buy into these social norms. So you can view it as an Asch conformity experiment. So the Asch conformity experiment is a famous experiment in which the subjects had to match a line. And what they didn't know is that everybody else in the experiment was a stooge, and they all picked the wrong line. So they were in this position where they could see that they were picking the wrong line. You were supposed to match them by the correct length. And they were all picking the line with the wrong length. But they almost overwhelmingly gave in to the consensus of the group. But the key takeaway from the experiment is when just one other person, one of the other stooges, said the correct line, then the subject of the experiment felt empowered and they could go against the consensus of the group. They only needed one other person, and that could turn the tide. So social norms that emerge spontaneously only work if they get very widespread buy-in. Otherwise they collapse, just like an Asch conformity experiment collapses when there's another fellow dissident. So that'll close out this video. The next video really will dive into the social science. We'll talk about the concept of rational utility maximizers. We'll talk about Kevin Murphy and Gary Becker's model of the rational drug addict and how the concept of hyperbolic discounting refutes that concept. And we'll get into more about the limbic system and superstimuli and other concepts. So it really will be much more social science and much less history and philosophy.